Hello, listeners. I'm Stéphane Zanoni, and today I'm pleased to have Marc Low, the Director of Innovation, Growth, and Emerging Tech at KPMG, joining me on the podcast. Marc and I first met at the Upper Bound AI conference, and then again had a chance to meet when we spoke at our annual Riva company event. And since then, it seems like the innovation around AI, Gen AI, and AI agent has continued to skyrocket. I really look forward to today's conversation.
Me too.
Before we get started, Marc, why don't you share a little bit about your career path and how you ended up in your current role?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me, first of all, and great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. I spent the last decade and a bit in this type of space. I was fortunate enough to start my career in technology, so working for technology companies here in Vancouver, and really learning the game as technology shifted from traditional on-prem architectures to cloud, and the evolution of software as a service and all these type of emerging models, and then did a transition from there into professional services, into consulting. Worked for another one of the big four for a long period of time, and ended up running the innovation group out of there, and then moved back to Canada, where I'm ultimately met the managing partner here at KPMG, and have been building this innovation group inside KPMG for the last 3 years, which has been an amazing adventure, and gives me the opportunity to touch and experiment all the stuff that's on the bleeding edge, and really work with clients from a place of empathy, helping them understand this fantastic landscape of solutions, trying to articulate how fast the world is moving and evolving, and really helping them understand how they should position their organizations in order to at least ride the wave, and certainly to avoid being disrupted themselves. And so the work is challenging. Every day is different, really varied, which is fantastic. You can't ask for anything more. And gives me an opportunity also to work with clients across all kinds of industries, from public to private sector. So the work is challenging, rewarding, exciting, and gives us the opportunity to really be on the bleeding edge of everything that's happening.
And you talked a little bit about where you were before, and before we talk about the present a little bit, maybe just talk to us a little bit how you've seen AI transition from maybe more of that machine learning predictive model for anomaly detection to really what we see today, where it's much more conversational. What was that transition like in the enterprise?
Almost overnight. Insofar as it became topical, like just from one moment to the next. Historically, I'm coming to you this afternoon from our Ignition Center, which is our innovation space at KPMG. And one of the groups that is housed inside the Ignition Center is our Lighthouse function, which is our data and analytics group. And these are all PhD level data scientists, statisticians, right? Software engineers. And that really was the domain of AI for the longest time. And probably much to their regret now, it's been democratized for everybody's access, right? So everyone thinks that they're a data scientist and an AI professional now, right? But it really was that transition from highly technical, solutions really that sat in the background. Like one of the analogies that I use when I'm speaking to clients, right, is, your cell phone is packed with AI solutions, almost entirely which have been developed by very, very smart people, and these solutions sit in the background. They help inform how you interact with technology. And that fall of really 2022, right, when ChatGPT became the kind of it had achieved Kleenex status, right? It became a brand that all of a sudden everyone was talking about. It really was that thing, and all of a sudden, I remember having the conversation with my managing partner, saying, like, this feels like a thing that's happening. And literally, we went into Christmas break, and by January, every CEO, every board of directors wanted to talk about it suddenly, right? And it's not like the topic broadly was new. It's just that because it had morphed into this conversational interface where you're packing all these traditional paradigms into something that anybody can interact with, all of a sudden that unlocked hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of use cases, and every organization suddenly sprinting to figure out what that meant for them. So, If you had worked inside the space before that, it probably felt like this was a multi-decade kind of evolving story. But I think for most non-technical folks, it was kind of like an overnight flip the switch, and all of a sudden everybody needs to be thinking about it, which is challenging, right? In terms of helping for organizations trying to understand, like, what do I do with this thing all of a sudden? And trying to separate sort of hype, like signal from noise, right? Hype from reality, but then also very exciting, right? Because it opens up a whole new landscape of opportunities. So it's, when we talk about paradigm shifts, it sometimes can feel a bit hyperbolic. This really did feel like a paradigm shift that you were experiencing in real time, which was really exciting.
And that timeline you described of leaving for the Christmas holidays and then coming back and everything being different. I know with the Riva team, we basically took the entire product roadmap for the next 2 to 3 years,
bundled it,
just threw it out, and had to reimagine it.
Yeah, there are. It's and it hasn't stopped, right? I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and they were talking about workflow automations, and I won't mention the particular organization, but there was we had built some low code applications on it, and it's a workflow orchestration piece of software, right? And that was cutting edge 3 years ago, and all of a sudden, all that's been usurped, by these platforms that are now, conversational. They're helping you stitch workflows together in agentic workflows and so on. And so, organizations are literally rewriting their entire kind of code base on the fly. Very large CRM based organization. Again, I won't mention this particular brand, but had a big conference. Their famous annual conference this past week, right? And they had to do a full pivot, right? Their entire architecture, the entire kind of reason for being for that platform rewritten overnight. So every organization's struggling with it and wrestling with it and trying to figure out what it means. So again, I'd say in empathy to your team at Riva, you're certainly not alone.
Well, it's a new. I'm really excited about the shift in maybe the traditional user interface of maybe having a user interface with a dozen predefined rules with checkboxes, to then just having a prompt that has guardrails, and now the end user can really ascribe some of the behaviors and some of the logic flow that they want to see the system take. Are there real life examples of organizations or of technology where we really see that applying in a tangible way in the enterprise?
My answer is it will be in a couple of parts. So one is the good news is that in our experience, right, the work that we've been doing over the last sort of year and a half, specifically around generative AI, we've documented 900 and counting use cases for generative AI inside the organization. In consulting speak, we would talk about front office, middle office, back office, meaning front office, stuff that touches your customer, back office, typically things like finance, your middle office, things like, HR and legal and others. Across that spectrum of functions inside the organization, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of use cases. That's kind of point number one to the answer. The second point is that there's a great tweet that I came across the other day, and the tweet. So I won't claim it. The language is mine, but the tweet was that there are no AI shaped holes lying around waiting to be filled. And what that gentleman meant by that was you have to think differently. So your point about this conversational interface. What the tools are doing is taking the way that we think about information, process information, the logic flows that we kind of that we learn and develop over time as we come up in our career and gain experience. You're taking that and codifying it in software. And so you need to think differently about what that means for your workflow. And the first comment that we make to clients is you need to start thinking in Visio, right? You need to start thinking about the steps that you take from, I have to do this thing to get to this output, right? And what are the steps that are happening in between? Where might generative AI play a role in accelerating bits of that? What do I need to think about as a consequence of using that technology, right? Because it doesn't work like a calculator. At the end of the day, it's a predictive model. It's spitting out things that it thinks is going to make you happy and keep engaged in the tool. And so that has implications in terms of the work that you get done. And so you need to start thinking in these kind of workflow oriented ways. And so it's not, the headline is, hey, we can use it for our accounts receivable process in finance, but that's kind of only the headline view of that. The subheading of that is all the steps that happen in there. And some of that is generative AI. Some of that is going to be other technology solutions, and some of that's going to be good old-fashioned humans. And so the work is really to figure out, I need to get this thing done, and the output looks like this. What are the steps along the way? And how do I need to reimagine what tools I use to get there? And we're not used to thinking about technology in this way. We're used to thinking about technology like Excel or like a calculator, right? Where I know that I need to add two numbers together. I put it in the machine then spits out 1 + 1 predictably equals 2. And generative AI is not like that. And so it's a different paradigm in terms of how you interact with technology. It's a different paradigm in terms of what you're asking the technology to do. And it's a different paradigm in terms of making sure that the end product that you get out of the back is predictably the same so that it's useful in a business context. Because most of the work that we do inside organizations in those 900 processes that I'm describing that we've mapped some Gen AI to, most of that is not just like, hey, do a first draft of something and publish it. There's a whole bunch of steps that go along the way. And so that's really where organizations, I think, are still struggling in some ways, is to map that landscape of 900 and growing use cases to the organizations, and then how do you reimagine the workflows that those sit on top of?
And so if I was at Riva, we've kind of jumped in with both feet into the deep end. But if I was to get started, where would I start to learn about assessing the areas that have the greatest impact to those 900 use cases? You use the 900, that feels like an infinite possibility when you're looking at the entire business spectrum of all these use cases. How do you isolate that, and where do I get started as a leader in my organization?
Yeah, great question. The $64,000 question. Where do I start? Typically, what we advise is you start in an area of the business that is really what you're assessing at an organizational level is feasibility and risk. And so, typically we would say, like, don't start with the thing that interacts directly with your consumer, as an example, right? Where if you're learning how these systems work and the types of outputs that they create, and that has impact on your brand directly in terms of how you interface with the consumer, that's probably not the best place to start for most organizations. Most organizations are starting in that middle or back office and picking, in terms of selecting the kind of area of the business, that's a little bit of an art in terms of you're looking for stuff where you think you've got a significant amount of homogeneous process. So that's really what you're looking for, is you're trying to pattern match the ways that in those 900 use cases I'm articulating, there's a bunch of kind of patterns of usage. So you're trying to pattern match that usage to your processes. To have value, you want to have a lot of similar styles of work being done inside that group. And that's kind of top down, like executive level view of where do you start. So finance tends to be one place, HR tends to be one place, legal tends to be one place that organizations are kind of starting to think about it. And then the second part of the art of that is then each organization is different in terms of that group's appetite to experiment. And so that's a little bit of a, only sometimes, you need to understand how the different groups will think about their appetite to experiment. And then the last part of the process is then to take that group that you've identified as your kind of, your test bed, right? So for example, your in-house legal counsel. Then the work is then to spend some time understanding, like, hey, what is a day in the life of this person inside that group? What are the things that they're doing on a day-to-day basis? How can we kind of quantify that and start to bucket workflows, again, to start to pattern match? And what you're looking to do is identify really effort, impact, and feasibility. So when I say effort, like how hard is it to make that behavior change? How hard is it to stand up that solution? How impactful would that be? So if we identify a solution and you're doing it once, like if it's one thing that you're doing inside that group, it better be very, very high value. And in some cases, like in your legal group, it can be. So we worked with a client where multiple 7 figures worth of legal work is flowing out the back door to external counsel because their internal teams can't get to enough stuff. So that might just be like one thing that they need to do, right? That's a very high value, low volume, great use case, right? And then the last piece of it is the feasibility, which means how readily accessible is the data, how clean is the data that it sits on, and so on, because all these systems are being driven from the data inside your organizations. So if you, for example, are sitting on Microsoft SharePoint and the SharePoint's a disaster, well, guess what? The outputs from your generative AI tools are also going to be a disaster. And so that's the last piece of it is, really effort, impact, and feasibility in terms of things like data. Once you've done all of that, then there's an assessment around, the risks and how do you identify them and mitigate them. But the first piece is, pick a group where you've got a lot of similar types of processes. And ideally, it's not customer facing, so you can isolate the sort of experimentation of it. And then, once you pick that group has high appetite for experimentation, now you start to think about, okay, let's start to map those workflows, identify where we can start, itemize those, and then prioritize those. And pick off the ones that are the least effort, highest impact. That's typically where we start. Experiment, put some runs on the board to prove that it can be done, and then you can start to build your roadmap of things that you want to do next. And our view is that ultimately it's going to touch every part of every business. So it's not like it's a one and done. It's really just about how do you start, learn a lot about what's required to stand these solutions up, and then you can start to scale that out across your org.
And when we had an economist come in and speak to the team, and one of the things that they had identified was that there's a productivity gap in the industry, or not just our industry, but there's a productivity gap in the world economics. And when I look at some of the stats that I had read, something like 10% of Canadian businesses were leveraging generative AI today. And when we think about automation and productivity, what do you think is needed in order to transition that, to get that number to double in the next couple of years? What's required in order to see that number increase to get that adoption rate up?
Yeah, that's a tough one for sure. A couple of thoughts. One is the technology is evolving very, very quickly. So, I think there's an accessibility issue. You can go and, any one of us, can take our credit cards and sign up for ChatGPT tomorrow or today, right? You can start to use it. But that doesn't really help you in a business context, because you got to be thinking about the safety of your data, what you're inputting there and how it's training the models. And also, of course, all the things around, can you trust the output in a business context, right? And so right now there's a gap between, I want to do this thing, and to stand it up at an enterprise level in a way that the organization can trust both the system architecture and the outputs of those tools. That there's a gap there. My view is that is shortening very, very quickly, and that as the tools become more sort of prolific, the large platforms are going to figure out how to make it more accessible and reduce the barrier of entry cost-wise to stand those systems up. That's kind of point number one. Point number two is that they're going to proliferate across every major platform. So the big, any big enterprise platform will have some version of generative AI baked into it from one of the providers. And then the last piece is that is really the skilling around it, right? So the challenge, the tension with putting these systems inside organizations is, this bit of a joke, not joke, right? But if you go, hey, there's a 30% productivity uplift, right, to use these tools. Well, in a team of 3 people, you're kind of looking to your left and looking to your right and trying to think, well, that's going to impact one of us, right? Not quite sure which. And so that's part of the story is, a little bit of the narrative, I think, is that there's a justifiable, understandable fear that it's disruptive to, the world of work, and that's all of us feed our families. And, so that's a natural reaction. I think it's unfounded in that really what we're seeing is that the use of these tools radically accelerates the work that people do. And that has big implications in terms of, if you can lean into that as an individual and really get the benefits of these tools, massively accelerates you as a professional, and in turn, accelerates your organization. That's really the main kind of headline there. But because we've got tens of thousands of years of survival baked into the backs of our brains, right? You get introduced to something new, and all of a sudden your fight or flight mechanism kicks in. And so there is resistance at an individual level sometimes to implement these tools. And so I think as people get more familiar, that barrier will come down, and that really the users will take that list of 900 use cases that I'm articulating, and that'll double, triple, quadruple in very short order as people figure out, hey, I could do it for this, I could use it for this, I could use it for this. And it's benefiting me personally in terms of the work that I can do. So I think it's that combination of things. So as that happens, I think the usage of the tools will accelerate, and you're going to start to see the benefits in terms of that productivity uplift rather. And in Canada, especially, that's we can certainly use it. Right? There's a notable productivity gap per capita in Canada relative to our neighbors to the south, and so this is part of the story of how can this act as a lever for all of us.
And so when we look at AI in the enterprise, I think what I heard you say is, we need a place that can store confidential information and can gate some of the training so that we're not training public models with corporate data. Are we seeing an increased adoption in financial services, across industries, or are there certain sectors that are more eager to jump onto these technologies?
Well, the ones like the types of clients that Riva services, right, are, especially in financial services, that's one of the places we've seen huge adoption. And again, I'd say that's partly a reflection of, the sense of, as I'm describing, the large groups with a lot of homogenous type of processes. The big banks, the big financial institutions are going to be very ripe for that type of implementation, right? Where you can see very clearly that if I put it inside this part of my organization, I'm going to get a big productivity uplift. It's a big lever for the organization. So they've been one of the first, for sure, financial services. The distribution outside of a couple of core industries has been, I would say, fairly consistent. And the laggards really are the ones where the core business is not technology. So I think about things like, some of the extractive industries in Canada, right? Forestry or whatever, where the core of the business is, grow a product in the ground, harvest it, and put it into market. And so, those types of organizations where the core of the business is still in a legacy type of industry, those are probably the ones that are a little bit on the slower side. And the rest, I would say, between those two poles is a lot of experimentation and people trying to figure out how to scale it. And that's partly a discussion around the cost of the technical effort to do that and the change required inside the organizations to really get it to scale. And so those two challenges are, everyone's in the same boat trying to figure out how to solve for that problem. But those are the sort of barriers to seeing more kind of widespread adoption when you're in that middle kind of cohort.
Is there anything, Marc, that you wanted to talk about or specifically call out that we haven't yet touched on?
Well, what I would love your listeners, first of all, I think, the markets that Riva serves are the ones where this is the Riva solution and the types of conversations that you're going to have with clients are right in this wheelhouse. So I think, super exciting for Riva to be at this particular point in time is comment number one. And really the solutions to reduce the barrier to entry for organizations to leverage this, that's the name of the game in this phase is kind of, I think, point number one. Point number two is, on an individual basis for the folks that are listening is really to get your mindset in a place where these tools are a lever for you, right? There's that Archimedes famously said, give me a lever long enough and a place and a fulcrum and a place upon which to stand, I'll move the world, right? And generative AI is that tool, and you are the lever. And really, what the call to action is to lean into experimenting with the solutions to try to figure out where it can personally benefit you as an individual. And it requires a high degree of agency. It requires everyone to take a leap of faith, lean in, and get a little bit uncomfortable. But if you approach it from the perspective of how can this benefit me, and how do I rethink how I need to position myself in a world where knowledge and reasoning is ubiquitous because everyone's going to have access to the same tools. The question you have to ask yourself in terms of, your, how do you have value in the marketplace of talent, right? Is your ability to apply the results that are coming out of these tools, your ability to create context around the results, the ability for you to to really do more and push beyond the boundaries of what you typically would have done, right? And so, me, I'm a strange one. I like being on stage. I like, my parents would tease me, right, that I haven't met a microphone that I didn't like. But I'm not particularly good at analyzing financial statements. Generative AI is a lever for me to be able to do that, right? Now, what does that allow me to do? Well, if I'm looking, my part of my job is innovation inside KPMG and working with clients around, understanding what solutions do you need to bring into the fold, and how do you think through the financial implications of that. Generative AI is a tool for me to be able to, contribute to that conversation in a way that I couldn't before. And so, if you start to think about the skill sets that you have, you used to think about it as I get really deep expertise in the thing that I do, and that's what creates my personal moat, right? Or that's what makes me valuable in the marketplace. You need to rethink how you're positioning against these tools. And so, the only real message for individuals and organizations is you can feel any kind of way about the technology. All of your emotional reactions are valid. The only thing you can't do is put your head in the sand and pretend it's not happening, because the tools are proliferating in the marketplace inside organizations. And so the gig or the goal is to experiment, to get comfortable, and to figure out how to drive value with them.
And a lot of what you've just described has to do about experimentation. And in many cases, some of these enterprise organizations have an aversion to experimenting with some of this data because it's such an important set of data or corpus of information. How do you work with customers to let them understand, or with clients, help them understand the value that's in the data, but then also exposing some of that data in ways that traditionally would have had answers of no? You want to do what with my data? Is there building trust in the data, building trust with trusted vendors? Are any recommendations there on how, for the first time, we're looking at fine-tuned models, we're looking at vertical AIs, we're looking at micro LLMs trained on your corpus of information that never would have happened before?
Part of the answer is a technical answer, which is, you architect your system and solution in a way where your data is secure, the model's not being externally trained, and so on. So that there are relatively straightforward ways to protect the data. The harder question, I think, is, we used to talk about, at KPMG, we used to talk about responsible AI. That's how we would brand that view of, how do you leverage these tools responsibly? We've actually rebranded that to trusted AI, which I much prefer, because it articulates what you're sort of a conversation in multiple parts. One is, is your data secure? Can you trust that that technically speaking, the sensitive data that you're referencing, right, is not being pushed into the outside world? So that's, step number one. Step number two is the stuff that's harder to get to, which is what you're referencing in the first part of the question. Can you create the space to experiment? Can you then understand what the tools are doing and create process and rigor around being able to trust the output of what these tools provide in a business context? Much harder. And so the conversations that we have at a sort of C-suite or board level is really more trying to articulate, listen, the world around you is changing. It's changing very, very quickly. So to refuse to experiment is to really, sign your own metaphorical death warrant as an organization, right? Because your competitors and a whole bunch of emerging competitors are going to be using these tools and leveraging them, and they will competitively eat your lunch. And so it's really the mindset shift around, can you create the space to experiment, knowing that a whole bunch of stuff you experiment and build, you're going to throw away, right? And that's okay. That's not failure. It's a mindset shift, trying to figure out, like, you're in search of value. You're in search of a new way of doing things, and so you got to create the space to do that. And really, that's the sort of invitation for clients in that conversation. So yeah, first part of the answer is really, it's about technically ensuring that you can experiment safely. The second part is creating the mindset and the space to experiment, and then figuring out what's that roadmap to go from experimentation to enterprise hardened, so you can start to put these solutions into production and rewrite the processes that your organizations use to then deliver that end product or end value.
Well, I think I've heard it coined either responsible AI or ethical AI. The trusted AI is a great way to summarize it. I feel like a lot of it comes back to explainability and how prevalent would it be, or is it going to be, for the language models to have to include explainability in the enterprise space? And one of the things, if I've got the document repository with all of my contracts and I ask it, which contracts have these articles in it, please summarize them, to have all of those documents referenced is also another great way of showing this is where I found the evidence to make this claim. Where does explainability fall into creating trust?
It's part and parcel of it, absolutely. So, a retrieval augmented generation solution, right, is you're hoping that it's going to leave that trail of breadcrumbs. You want to build it in a way where it's creating those references. Commercially, there's solutions like Perplexity, which have done that, trying to replicate a Google style experience, right, of giving you the answer and then creating those references. And really, that's in an enterprise context, to build a similar type of solution, you want to have that same story. There's a nuance in that explainability story, which is also, I think, the idea of yes, references as part of it. So what data sources did the tool use to create the output, and how did the tool think through that process? But then, have you also ethically thought through the implications of using these tools in the context of your business operations? So the metaphor I tend to use with clients is something to the effect of, imagine a dating app, right, which is driven by algorithms, and that's sort of a version of what's happening inside one of these generative AI models, right? You can engineer the algorithm for all kinds of outcomes, not all of which are ethical. And so it depends. You got to be very clear about what business outcome you're trying to drive. And the explainability piece comes back to this idea of, if we live in a world where these AI systems are driving business decisions, and the outcome then is being pushed out into the world, you better be able to articulate what was the logic behind how we leverage these systems, what was the output that we created, and how can we articulate how we got from point A to point B, right? And so that again that's part and parcel of that trusted AI story. Is ethics and explainability are really key to thinking through, what do I want to do with these solutions? Am I doing that in a way that's ethical? Am I being mindful of the end state or the solution that's being driven, and being able to explain not only how we got there in terms of the technical sort of steps of the tool, but what was the thinking that drove that outcome as well. And so, especially in large organizations where you're thinking about, publicly listed entities and so on, right? There will be a whole bunch of regulatory reporting requirements around the use of these tools, and so organizations, need to be thinking in that context as well, right? And so, any good deployment of these solutions inside organizations like that takes that into account. And right now, it is still a little bit of the wild west in terms of regulators trying to catch up to where the technology sits, but ultimately it'll form part of it, in the same way that ESG reporting requirements are starting to come down the pipe from regulators. The same thing will cascade around the use of AI systems. So we think that's kind of the next phase of where this is all headed.
The very next element in that journey for me really is around the bias in data, bias in the intention. Any suggestions for some of the listeners is how you can interrogate the data to suss out any kinds of biases, or think about the problem in a way that might eliminate some bias in the teams that are solving these problems?
Yeah, again, it's a two-sided answer. It's a like good news, bad news. The good news is, I think, well, the bad, maybe let's start with the bad news. Let's start with the bad news first. Bad news is we're all biased. And so, what the tools do is they codify that bias. And so that's point number one on the sort of tool and solution side. Interrogating the data for bias is more of a data science problem. I would probably defer the technical, parts of that to colleagues of mine who are more clever than I am on that topic. But I think the good news is that what the conversation has forced us to do is to interrogate in the first place. So until we were sort of talking more broadly about the use of data, the use of AI, in stitching it together into every facet of business, that the discussion was the domain of a really relatively small number of folks. And so what we're doing now is actually having an open discussion about, hey, what data sets are we using? What bias is baked into those? How can we be aware of it? How do we interrogate it to try to minimize that impact as much as possible? And then when we layer a tool on top of that data set, how are we thinking very carefully about how that tool was trained, how that bias that has been now baked into the tool will influence our outcomes, and so on. Again, the bad news is that bias exists all around us. It's baked into what we do as humans. The good news is we're having the conversation and interrogating the data and the tools in a way that we can then stand behind what that output's going to be. And again, that is coming back to that sort of sense of trusted AI to interrogate that bias, both in the data and the tools.
And we can't talk about trusted AI without thinking about some of these autonomous vehicles. And I spent the week in San Francisco last week, and I took my first driverless car experience. And it's wild.
I haven't had the pleasure yet personally. But I've certainly watched all the videos, and I mean, this is exactly what you're driving at, right? Pardon the pun. How do these systems in real time interrogate what they're sensing, and then how do they drive decision making on the back of that? So that's a very real life example of the challenge of exactly that. And so there's a whole bunch of sort of AI ethics questions around how do you think through that problem set and so on. But in that example, it's really life and death, literally.
And that feels like one end of the spectrum where you've got a system that's making decisions on our behalf. And then the other end of the spectrum seems to be maybe a more traditional recommendation type system. Is there, you've got recommendations on one end of the spectrum, and then you've got a system that's taking action on behalf of its participants. What is the lifeline, or what is the spectrum that we should be considering for the trusted AI or for trusted execution at the enterprise?
All the way through, I would say. And in fact, I think the stuff that you're articulating there around the recommendation engines, in some ways that can be almost more insidious if you're not careful. So I think of an example of basic one, right? But credit applications in a financial institution, right? How are decisions being made about what to approve, what not to approve, right? And going back to this idea of bias, if you're not very careful about how do you think about what data sets are being driven into that decision-making engine, even to recommend, yes, no, you create unintended outcomes in terms of what that, what the output is. And so the immediate consequence is more readily apparent when it's a system that's autonomous or semi-autonomous. And that'll become more and more important in the organizational context as these tools move from recommendation engines to sort of agentic workflows or autonomous, semi-autonomous workflow agents inside an organization. But the conversation is the same all the way across, which is thinking very, very carefully about are we accounting for what's baked into the data that's going into it, and then what outcome are we trying to drive as a result of the tools. And so I think it's more a function of what's the immediate impact, but the lens should be the same across that spectrum.
And so when we start to think about these autonomous flows and we start to consider this concept of the agent or the AI agent, it feels like there's been a transition in the industry where we went from Gen AI type co-pilots to now transitioning to an agent-based experience where you now have maybe a highly tuned model that has very specific guardrails that's looking to solve for a specific set of problems. Where are you seeing that shift happening, and how quickly do you think that transition from these horizontal language models, the OpenAIs of the world, to much more vertical solution fit outcomes?
My sense of it is that it's going to be a hockey stick kind of adoption. It's slow at the moment, and part of the reason is that where we're seeing a lot of early agentic workflows is in things like customer service interactions or sales and marketing type interactions where you want to you're getting a piece of input. So imagine customer lands on your website, they provide some they provide some input to you, right? They give you their email address or their telephone number, and we would have talked about previously robotic process automation of taking just that input, driving it into a CRM, and then cascading some actions out of that. And where people are layering these tools is to say, great, I'm getting this piece of customer information. I'm putting it directly as a workflow into my CRM. That's triggering some research that informs an email or some type of customer service interaction and so on. Because the tools are still relatively early, I would say that the quality of that output is mixed. And so to scale that into large enterprises where the appetite for risk in those interactions is lower, that's where it's going to be slower. So I'm just giving one example, but that's where we've seen kind of the early stuff. My sense of it is that as the technology improves, so the results get more predictable, the interactions and the ability to build those workflows becomes better, and the ability to the cost to stand them up becomes easier. You'll see them proliferate. You're already seeing a few of those for example, Microsoft Copilot has built a workflow tool inside Copilot itself, inside Copilot Studio. And so I think those type of solutions will start to proliferate as the technology gets better, it gets more easier to consume, and therefore gets pushed into more and more of the org, and the results or the outputs of the tools become more predictable and more useful at an enterprise scale. And so it's relatively easy to build proofs of concept. Take that again. It's relatively easy to build proofs of concept for these type of flows to make them enterprise ready at enterprise scale. That's where the effort is still significantly higher, and that's why the adoption hasn't hit quite as hard yet, but definitely coming. To me, the next part of the discussion is, in a world where it's easy to build workflows, the results are predictable, and effectively a piece of software is driving a lot of those interactions. What role do humans play, or rather, what type of world does that create? And that's the harder question, or the thing that's a little bit chunkier is, if organizations can flood the zone with content and interactions that are all software driven, software initiated, software created, how do you stand out competitively in that landscape? And that's, I think, where ironically the pendulum's going to swing the other way, and the future's largely going to be driven. It's like the future is human. The future is not AI. The future is driven by humans that can take those tools and then layer value on it, apply your sense of your sense of context, your experience, your for lack of a better word, taste, right? As a human, to then take those tools and outputs and then drive some human-oriented value, right? Because at the end of the day, we're just two meat bags walking around, sucking up oxygen and having a human experience, right? And really what these tools are, the implication of these sort of agentic workflows is that you start to really attack the nature of what it means to come together as an organization. And really it's about humans coming together, creating something that has value to other humans, and the buying experience is at the end of the day a human-to-human interaction. And so the question is going to be, how do humans then layer into that process, even though it's driven or fueled by these agentic workflows? At the end of the day, it's really about humans having a human experience. And so that's where that's the chunkier, grittier conversation, I think, of the implication.
Well, and I wonder what the scenario would be like if you've got two agents representing the buyer and the seller, how that interaction becomes humanistic, and how do you prevent the human element from being removed from that experience?
Or do you even want that? Right? These are the fundamental, philosophical questions of what does it mean? What does it mean for an organization to have to be represented there? There's all kinds of really, we can rabbit hole this one big time, but there's all kinds of really interesting implications, I think, around what does that mean for organizations to be represented by an AI agent, for example, in a procurement discussion, right? What is that? What are the ethics and outcomes of that? Do you even want that? Never mind the idea of, I think there's a lens here where it's kind of the venture capital view of the whole opportunity, where it's like, if you humans are an extraneous distraction to organizations creating stuff and selling to one another, but that's not typically how the world is actually structured, right? That at the end of the day, business has always been about how do you optimize the delivery of that thing. But at the end of the day, I've still got to sell you, Stéphane, something for $1, and I've got to produce it as efficiently as possible, obviously, to create as much profit. That's the goal of a capitalist system, right? I'm going to sell you something for $1, and I'm going to produce it as efficiently as possible to maximize my return on it. But it's not just two solutions autonomously interacting with one another, doing something, right? That's, to me, that's sort of antithetical to what it means to come together and do it in the first place. Anyway, these are weird and wild, nebulous philosophical discussions about what our world is likely to look like on the back of it. So mostly what I spend my days doing is prognosticating with organizations about, how do you take that first step, and how do you think about kind of getting started on that journey. But we're all figuring it out, right? We are literally building the plane as we fly it.
Well, I look at it as being AI, maybe AI powered, not necessarily AI driven.
Yes, I think that's exactly the right right lens. That we're all going to have these tools at our disposal, and every organization is going to have them driven into their in the work they do on a daily basis. But that we are going to be AI enabled or AI powered, and not AI driven is my prediction for where it's all headed.
So thank you very much, Marc, for your time today. I think we both agree that it's a better together situation when it comes to leveraging AI, and appreciate everyone joining us for our RevTech podcast.